All right, our second topic is going to be about injury prevention. And now, the direction I'm going to go with this, as you're going to see from the agenda, is going to be more about stress and load management in general. And then I'm going to get into more about how we can use strength and conditioning for this injury prevention. So, primary considerations, and it's important we always go over this because who are we dealing with and what are you going to be dealing with. So before you even begin to consider like ways to train for injury mitigation, you have to consider the inhibitors and facilitators you're going to face. So these are like anything in program design. It's going to be your sport, the demands of the sport, the season phase, level of play that you're dealing with, schedule, all right, demographic, who you're working with. In particular, with in regards to injury prevention, chronological and biological age is going to come in and be a big factor when we're with a younger demographic. Experience, in and out of the gym and on the field. The more advanced we are in the gym and the more advanced we are on the field or ice or wherever, typically the forces are going to be higher and we're going to be associated with greater risk for acute injuries. Resources, time, space, and equipment in general. What do we have to help ourselves in the procedure of injury prevention? And then freedom, responsibility. Like how much access do we have to the athletes and to all of these? Or are we under lock and key? So, when we expand on this, the sport encompasses biomechanics, psychological, and physiological inputs and outputs that underpin the type, frequency, and/or prevalence of injury in sport. Okay, so sport's going to be the MOI, I guess, for everything, and it comes in different forms. So, contact versus non-contact. There's a higher prevalence of acute in contact versus more chronic and non-contact sports. Individual versus team, intrinsic and extrinsic, young versus old. We're dealing more with maturation versus something like osteopenia. The level of play, like we said, the speed of game, the prevalence of high forces, the playing surface, the input of instability or stability, duration, fatigue, season length, exposure to full recovery, game density is going to influence frequency of stress. And then, of course, like if we're using an external implement or just our body, and we have to worry about that impact on our body, plus the type of injuries that come with getting slashed by a stick, for example, or getting hit in the face by a puck, blah, blah, blah. Sporting demands, like we're going to go into, but obviously ground contact times, strength, speed, power, and how much of these physical qualities are are limited or facilitated throughout the sport will be an indicator for the type of injuries we'll get. Sprinting, maybe more hamstring, calf stuff, versus strength might be, an acute injury like a broken arm. But let's talk about stress and to understand that not all stress is created equal. Let's take an example of a pro soccer athlete. Obligation number one for them is going to be their practice and training. That's why they're there. They're there to enhance their skill. That's their day job. You know, that's obligation number one. And it's going to typically take on more of a physical more than a mental load. Obviously, there's a mental aspect to everything, but it's important to understand that it's primarily physical. Then the second bulk of their energy is probably going to be taken up by games. That's the big money maker. That's game day is everything, but still more of a physical than mental, typically. Maybe it's even in this circumstance, but you get the point. And then the leftover of their battery is the social battery, social part of the battery, family, relationship, friends. And that's typically going to be more of a mental than a physical input and output. Now, take yourself as a university student or just as a university soccer athlete. They have practice and training. It's already getting clumped up, as you can see, but that's a physical input. Games, big thing for the athlete, but in the grand context of things, still just a small piece. Another physical input and output. Then we have relationships, we have family, and we have you time and social. And instead of putting all these together as a leftover, they really do take somewhat equal part when we're not, when we're not being paid to do this particular sport. So there's a higher degree of stress being placed on lower tier athletes because in general we're placed under different conditions. So it's important to state that although not all stress is created equal, stress is still stress. right? And the body perceives it as such. The response, no matter the input, is the same. Not to say that this is the same amount of accrued stress. There is allocation to stress in different ways, and the way the body is going to respond, as we're going to talk about, to stress is pretty much the same. So the body's response to stress will take effect based on the input, of course. So, physical stress accrues more physiological adaptations as a response to chemical signaling from the central and peripheral nervous system. Great. That's what training is. That's what we want. Psychological stress causes chemical reactions in response to vertebral and cranial responses. CNS stuff. And then, however, the input, the body perceives it as negative. So, even though in training we want to expose ourselves to stress, physical stress to cause physiological adaptations, too much of it, or regardless the input, the body is going to still perceive it as negative as it takes the approach to mitigate it as much as possible. Same thing with psychological stress. It might be watching a movie and there's scary scenes in it. We are having that fight or flight signals. Our brain's going off. It's stressed. We know logically by looking at it that it's just a scary movie and it's not real, but we're perceiving it as stress. And so our body is going to still perceive this as a negative stress. So, thus, the mitigation of excessive stress is critical in maintaining homeostasis, no matter the input. Load management. So now this is where we kind of get into the first bit of nuances of how strength and conditioning can impact um, injury prevention. So, how to manage load? Load management has been around for quite some time. Just players playing less or more minutes, for example, or guys taking a night off. But it's made a bigger uptick in its application in the S&C realm as of recently, as we're taking more of an educated approach to things. So, load management is effectively the mitigation of training and game stress through the management of volume, frequency, intensity in response to the athlete's preparedness, monitored through physical and cognitive evaluation. So, just looking at this little equation I come up with, athlete preparedness is going to be the cumulative sum of physical outputs and physical and psychological inputs. All right. So, an example, a fatigued player, how we can see if this person needs some form of load management. They don't feel good, metrics are low. We review the past week's training and realize, if we're using GPS, overall distance covered has been shorter, accelerations are shorter or not as fast as usual, or his training has been really, really tough and had a high density games. So now we decide we're going to reduce volume and intensity by about 20%, kind of an arbitrary threshold when we're looking at a regression in overall volume and intensity. I'm not going to go over this. You can look at it on the slides, but this is just two ways to go about general load management. One being loading the extrinsic stress of school, social life, and family, which we'll go over shortly. And then the other one is an auto regulation methods, the APR, RP, VBT, and stuff like that for inter and intra training load management strategies. But in terms of identifying if we need to manage some load, and there's some signs of fatigue through physical jump height, using plates and jump mats, we can check impulse and rate of force development, braking forces if they've gone up or gone down. We can see time to take off. We can see strategies just visually. From jumping, grip strength, typically a 10 to 20% reduction is going to be no bueno, and we're going to have to look at, okay, maybe this person's fatigued centrally. 10-meter fly sprints or any kind of sprint, anything greater than a 20% decrease is going to be definitely a concern. Abnormally sore, just ask them how they're feeling. If they're really sore, and especially greater than 48 hours out, if they're still experiencing delayed onset muscle soreness, then that's a cause for concern. Just the general RPE, if they did a session that's supposed to be pretty light and easy and then they feel like it killed them, then obviously that's not ideal. Maybe they're experiencing extra hunger or they're just straight up tired. All right. Mental and emotional, using athlete surveys is a great way. Just how you feeling, how you perceiving things. We can see that in the progress or regression throughout the weeks. Urine samples, obviously we can't always do this, but we can ask like, how's your urine looking? Then we can kind of check off if they're hydrating properly, this, that, or the other. Visually seeing changes in mood. We have to build those interpersonal connections so that we understand that an athlete is not acting the same as they usually are. Are they being quiet and reserved when they're usually not? Are they being emotional or explosively behavioral? Are they lacking motivation, whereas they usually have motivation? Are they increasingly irritated, have more self doubt? And did they have a breakdown? So these are all sort of things that we can see that they're really tired and in need of some form of load management. Looking at steps in general, three simple steps. Reducing overall external stress. So that's the low hanging fruit. Can we get more sleep? Sleep more than 8 hours. Try and get a little more sleep. Maybe have a nap. Nutrition, cut out processed refined sugars and focus on eating enough. Okay, having enough food in. And obviously clean best we can. Hydration, getting a little more water in, maybe adding some form of electrolyte supplementation so that we can make sure that water's staying in our system, and then completely eradicating any form of alcohol and drug consumption. Step two being reducing central fatigue through reduction in training intensity and volume. So this could be on field, but mostly off field stuff because sport is going to come first. And then we would then look at reducing peripheral fatigue through reduction in practice and game intensity. All right, volume and frequency. Obviously, that's the last thing we want to do. But at the same time, it is the highest exposure to the highest level of speed and force and change of direction. So, in general, if we're in a fatigue state, that's probably the most likely area that we're going to get injured in. Something to keep in mind. So, athlete load management profiling. So, this is an example of one that I do for some hockey players. So, we're just implementing the overall time spent in the gym and on the ice, and then their game minutes. And then we're basically just getting a graph to see how they're doing week to week in terms of volume. You can see this person's pretty erratic with, you know, upwards of 89% change week to week. This person had an injury, so and they went away for camp with the Ramparts, and then back and forth, miss a couple sessions of input, blah blah blah. Then the volume changes quite a bit. But essentially, what this does is allows us to add a multiplier to the minutes that they were doing an activity. So, strength training, like I know as the S&C coach what they're doing, so I can allocate a specific level of difficulty or a multiplier to what we're doing. And then the hockey coach can allocate a multiplier to what they're doing on the ice. And then based on how many minutes they played in the game, and then we get a profile. And then from week to week, we can just track how much or how little they're doing, big sways and changes, and then make assumptions from there. So for me, I kind of take away the idea of load management, and I like to call it more stress management. All right, I think that makes sense. But how to manage stress, we're gonna have to ask ourselves this as an athlete or as a coach. If you or anyone on your team, truly ever train to 100% effort. Who trains so consistently hard that you actually needed a break. Okay, likely not many. So will a deload in a program like a strength and conditioning program or recovery week really make a difference? Likely not in the grand scheme of things for the majority of people. What you did need, or what you would need to do without a doubt, is deload external mental stress. And we've talked about this already. So instead of immediately looking at training as the main input that causes stress, start looking at external stressors, papers, assignments, relationships, nagging parents, money, work, social expectations, Winterfest tickets. All these sort of things play on our mind that we are stressed about. And these are going to have, and as we recall, stress is equal across the board, or the way our body perceives stress is going to be relatively equal. If we're putting that stress on ourselves, that's going to then bleed into other things. And then, of course, because S&C is usually on the back burner or one of the first things to go, we allocate that stress to training when in reality it's external. So the shift now has to become towards managing stress inputs. All right. So fatigue and the physically demanding nature of sport will continue to play a pivotal role given its part in the equation, of course, right? Sport's number one, and it's always going to lead to some of the highest physical inputs. But considering sport is the primary obligation, from an athlete's perspective, managing external stress, sleep, hydrations, sleep again, social life is a much simpler task than mitigating playing time, reps, sets, and games. All right, we've covered this. Makes sense. As is the case in most situations, it always depends. All right, so as a coach, we need to be proficient at building a strong enough interpersonal connection with the athletes to be able to pick up on slight changes in mood swings, as these may oftentimes play the much bigger role in the outcome of performance than a physical output metric. All right, so think about an athlete that may have had the best sleep of their lives. They're jumping super high. They pretty much broke the grip machine, but they just found out that they had to put their 15-year-old family dog down. All right, consider that above all. So obviously, we're always looking at these metrics and everything's going well, but the mental stress is often unseen in the physical metrics. And we have to consider that above all, because if this person's thinking about how sad they are or about their dog throughout the game, no matter if they're having the best week physically of their lives, they're going to play poor. So, what's the overall goal of managing stress and load, anyways? And it's the concept of supercompensation, which I'm sure you've already heard about. But it's the idea that supercompensation is the biological response to the input of stress, whereby the system or our body is placed in a state of declining fitness due to this stress or training. So, followed by a period of recovery, the result is supercompensation and the enhancement of physical fitness. So, in simpler terms, we have a baseline. We put stress on our body through mental and physical inputs, and we go well below baseline. And then when we give ourselves recovery, which is the mitigation of stress and load, it allows our body to go back to baseline. And then as a result, due to recovery, we supercompensate. We go above our previous baseline and hit a new level of fitness. And that's what this looks like over time. And that's the ultimate goal of strength and conditioning. And to manage the variables in a way that allows us to force adaptation or drive adaptation to occur with respect to an athlete's capacity, obligations, and goals. And then if we get this right over time, we're linearly progressing in a positive direction. Rinse and repeat, and we drive significant adaptation. All right, so strength and conditioning. All right, how can we implement S&C to mitigate injury causation? So strength and conditioning can play a pivotal role in the mitigation of injury prevalence within the context of sport and everyday life, with influences on the following: musculoskeletal integrity, so our muscles, our muscles, ligaments, and tendons, our nervous system function, how we develop and how we maintain energy systems, or how fast we recover. That kind of goes with energy systems development, force production, our resistance to fatigue, our rigidity, mobility, and flexibility, how well we move in through full range of motion, strength at length, and then coordination, and through that skill acquisition on field, on ice, in sport, skill development. All right. So injury prevention for S&C, it's pretty subject specific, as everything is, and there are particular nuances that have to be taken into consideration with respect to the wide range of injury causation. All right, so one thought process or one train of thought is the idea that higher relative and absolute strength reduces risk of injury. And I'm sure we've all seen this infographic before, where there's a guy deadlifting, and it says, if you deadlift 3 times your body weight, you reduce something like 30 to 40% injury risk. Now, that's true, but there does exist an inverse relationship between strength and injury. All right, where as you are able to produce more force and expose your body to stimuli that causes robust adaptations to the morphology and structure of your musculoskeletal system. So as we're able to train and expose ourselves to resistance training that causes adaptations, you're also exposing yourself to heavy external implements that pose equal levels of risk. So the goal is to keep adding horsepower to your engine always, right? But at what cost? So if we have an F1 car that can exceed speeds of 200 kilometers an hour, it has the ability to take these corners super fast. um, it's able to do so at a much faster rate than the Ford Fiesta, for example. So yes, the F1 car can go 300 kilometers an hour. Yes, it can take tight turns, and it can do it a lot better than the Ford Fiesta, who can only travel max 140 kilometers an hour. So this engine is huge, its capacity is huge, but it also has the equal risk of crashing into the wall at 200 kilometers an hour. All right, so we have to think in the context of, do we need to go 200, 300 kilometers an hour around a corner? Or do we just need to upgrade our Ford Fiesta a little bit more? So maybe it's a fast Civic, or it's a Volkswagen Golf. Okay, it can still go pretty quick. It can take corners really well. It's robust and it's good on gas, but it doesn't go so fast that it's going to crash into the wall at 400 kilometers an hour. Right? Always exceptions to everything. So programming with this idea that if you just keep getting stronger, it will fix all your problems is a one track way to reduce transferability of physical qualities. So ultimately, that's not great. If we're just focused on that, we're actually reducing our ability to get better at our sport. It can overcook athletes doing too much, it can undercook skill development, and at a certain point, increase risk of injury. So, shifting the focus on being strong enough and towards maximizing expression of force will have a much higher carryover, is adaptive but not under recoverable, and can be carried for longer and at a higher frequency than traditional approaches. Okay, so this idea of being strong enough, and there's some arbitrary allocations of what is strong enough, but in general, if we can, bench our body weight and a half, we can squat 2 times our body weight, and we can trap our deadlift, 2.5 times our body weight, we're in a good place to be. All right. So when the question comes up now asking how do you program for injury prevention, it requires a multifaceted approach with these considerations, and they're always our considerations: the age, the training experience, sport and sporting demands, resources, frequency, and limiting factors. Okay, pretty simple stuff. It's rinse and repeat. And obviously, we're here to learn. So how do we implement S&C into injury prevention? So screening. All right, we need to be able to perform like a functional movement screen to identify mobility and asymmetries and any areas that might be limiting factors. Force plate curves and outputs, using force plates to identify further these asymmetries, force characteristics, how we're landing, how we're taking off, which limb is doing what, and for how much. Our stretch shortening cycle efficiency, what kind of jumping curves do we have? Are we bimodal? Are we unimodal? Are we bimodal late or early? These things matter. Strength metrics, absolute and relative strength, give us a great idea of our force producing capabilities, and then our relative capacity in those. Conditioning, aerobic and anaerobic, our VO2 max, our maximum aerobic speed, and our mental toughness. These are things that matter. Mental toughness included. It's a psychological one, but you get to see what kind of athletes you're dealing with. Change in directions and sprint speed are going to give you characteristics of your acceleration and top speed, as well as mechanics and, once again, your stretch shortening cycle efficiency. So the implementation of strength and conditioning through injury prevention, the warm-up is going to be your first low-hanging fruit and a really, really critical place to prep the body for upcoming stress, and gives you an opportunity to place particular attention on priming your body for the session with specific movements. And what's nice about this is that you're able to microdose things. So we are always talking about the importance of mobility and coordination, and then we fear that and top end speed and max acceleration, but we're always worried about allocating a whole day to those things because we feel like we're taking away from the gym. You don't have to. You can microdose, which means you can just sprinkle it in every day, and then over the week, if you have 3 sessions or 5 sessions, you now have consistent exposure to those stimulus. And it's just a great way to compound the stress and without it being so acute that you end up hurting yourself. So with the warm up, make it fun and engaging. Engagement equals high execution, which is great for priming. Okay, you're actually getting movement through full range of motion. We're using the ramp system: raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate. All right, we're microdosing the mobility and coordination. Fun drills. You can do a fun drill that it's engaging, that moves quickly and multi-directionally with high grade stimulus. That also works on coordination. All right, tennis ball drills are great for that. And then this can lead directly into the plyometric and ballistic component, where we're also using a similar microdosing model. where you can spread those intensive and extensive plyometrics as well as your ballistic throws throughout the week. Here's just an example, pretty basic, but your prep work, 1v1 knee tap game, getting your bodies to move in multi directions, you're cognitively activated, it's fun. A single arm tennis ball pass, you can do single arm, single foot, just work on coordination, a bit of balance, stability for a bit of time. And then an overhead squat, facing the wall, facing away, duck walk, walking, stuff like that. Adding that full body mobility in there. Usually, what I do is a little more extensive, where we're playing one particular game with everybody, and then we're going to do a series of mobilization drills. Then it leads right into your plyometrics, true and I guess non-true or false plyometrics, if you will. But split stance jumps, the deep tier jumps to get high muscle fiber recruitment, deep jump landing, depth jump landing, working on the decelerative forces, and then going to a high concentric output, so a pogo with arm swing, moving. And this is going to be dependent, like your plyos and are going to be dependent on the type of athlete you're working with and what they need. But example. Now, if we look at program design exercise order, so linear integration, it's going to help with the efficiently train each respective physical quality with a prerequisite state of freshness needed to adequately drive adaptation. So all that means is essentially we want to order the exercises so we're fresh for each one, respectively, of how much they need to be fresh in order to get adaptation. So we want to do all the power and speed, peak force stuff early on, followed by strength work. So central nervous system, slow and fast force. We need a pretty high degree of freshness for that because we're taking on the most amount of intensity. Hypertrophy is mostly tissue centric. So, you can be in a fatigue state. It actually is good. It allows for a prerequisite environment that's highly adaptive. And then we finish with core and conditioning because it's going to have it's pretty resilient. It's going to adapt under fatigue. And those two, or particularly conditioning, will have a higher degree of um, regression or impact, on everything else in terms of fatigue. So we put that last. Exercise prescription, low to high. We typically want to go the lower, higher intensity movements to the higher volume, lower intensity. And coincidentally, it follows the same order. Typically your power and speed is going to be pretty low volume, but high intensity. Your strength work is going to be low to moderate volume and moderate to high intensity. High volume, low, moderate intensity, hypertrophy, and then moderate to high volume for your core and conditioning. And I know you probably want to know which exercises to do for which injury. I'm not going to give particular exercises, but in general, your ACL, you want to do low amplitude plyos and landings. Want to work on abduction and adduction, the hip and the ankle and the knee. Hamstring, quad, and calf strengthening is always going to be good. All right. Shoulder and AC joint, banded abduction, adduction, extension, flexion, and rotation. We need full range of motion with slow tempo. The shoulder can be trained with pretty high volume. But you got to train it through all different ranges of motion because of the shoulder girdle and all the muscles involved, and because it's an articulating site of motion. Hips and low back, strengthening the glutes and core are going to be pretty much your main focus. Obviously, taking hips through full ranges of motion of flexion and extension, and you're already working on abduction, adduction for the rest of your body. So best to be working on that. And when we talk about glutes, we got to train the different muscles of the glute and through different ranges of motion. Of course, the core as well. Flexion, lateral flexion, extension, frontal extension, flexion, isometric, anti-rotation, rotational, like everything. All right, not just working on the rectus abdominis, the six pack, but working on everything. All right. Even box breathing is great for that. Ankle inversion, eversion, flexion and extension, calf strengthening, and tons of true plyometrics. Okay, just train it in all ranges of motion, and it's not like go into sand or make it an unstable environment. You use resistance training to amplify these metrics. Okay, the best you can. And plyos, nothing better than plyos, extensive and intensive to train the ankle complex, and then the hamstring. Hamstring strength via tempo, nice slow tempo and rapid tempo over speed eccentric work is really good for hamstrings. High force exposure, so sprinting regularly. Okay, there's no more violent stimulus than sprinting on the hamstrings, and that's typically where they get torn. So expose yourself to those stresses, so it's prepared for those stresses. Full range work, hip flexion and extension, and what we call delayed knee extension. Okay, glute, quad, and calf strengthening. Okay, so in general, when it comes to preventing injuries, we look at the site of injury. Excuse me, the typical site of injury. We look at how the muscles interact with the connective tissues, the ligaments and tendons. We understand the planes of motion in which it moves in, the typical planes of motion that you get injured in, and then we're going to just simply strengthen those and make sure that we're working antagonistically. So we're strengthening flexion and extension, for example, or if we're working on the biceps, we're also working on the triceps, all right, and trying to create this well-rounded body, being strong enough, okay, and then making considerations on the order of exercises, the intent in the exercises, and ultimately how we're managing stress both on and off the field with a particular shift of focus towards mitigating any off-field or out-of-sport stress from bleeding into the sport itself, okay? Early in the morning, I'm sorry, not the best presentation, but that's a wrap on that. Please let me know if you have any questions. This is a pretty deep topic that we can go extensively in, and I look forward to your questions. And yeah.